Today on the podcast, we are continuing our story of Walt Disney, Larry Watkin, and how the Disney studio transformed itself from a modest animation company into a full-blown live-action studio. I know at the end of last week's episode, I said I thought we had one more part to finish up this story, but really it's two. One this week and then one next week. There was simply too much to explore in a single episode and to cover all of the interesting developments in depth. But the series does end well, with a few surprises that I think will be new for most of our listeners. At some point over the years, I think I've described my process in creating these series. I work on outlines, which I often develop over many years. The outlines have most of the quotes and sources that I'll use in creating the script. On my end here, everything is footnoted like an article or an essay. The script for our current series on Larry Watkin, for example, has exactly 332 footnotes that identify each of the sources that I've used to put this story together. Sometimes these outlines are very long. The single-spaced outline for the series on Herb Ryman, for example, was almost 200 pages. Then, as we moved through the series together, I arranged the outline into a script, usually a week or two at a time, and sometimes it simply takes more words to explore the drama and the events than I had anticipated. And that's more or less why we have 2 episodes left and not just one. But there are lots of interesting elements as we move toward the end. This is the story not only of Larry Watkin and Walt Disney, but also of how the Disney company reinvents itself in the 1950s. But in terms of our story this week, we are just about up to the premiere of Darby O'Gill, which is one of the most significant live-action films overseen by Walt. As we left off last week, Larry Watkin was on vacation in Copenhagen with his wife, and Walt and the studio staff were putting together a premiere, one that appears to be rather quickly arranged in Dublin, not far from where Darby O'Gill was set. I can tell you this much up front. The release of this film was both a critical success and a moment where everyone involved at Disney knew that trouble was coming, forces that could change relationships at the studio. But before we jump back into the world of Darby O'Gill's premiere, I need to thank a few more Bandcamp subscribers. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. I'm deeply grateful to each and every person who supports us over on Bandcamp, because without them, this podcast would simply cease to exist. Thanks are going out today to new subscribers Joey C., Carl, Prof. Bostic, and MT Mason. Thanks to each of you for supporting all the things we do here. And now, let's circle back down into the world of the Disney studio as Walt and Watkin are about to end up again in Ireland. During the early weeks of June 1959, Larry Watkin and his wife were traveling through Denmark. Once their adventures in Scandinavia were over, they flew to London to spend a few days at the Dorchester Hotel, which for years had been Watkin's base of operations as he developed Disney features in the UK. When he reached the hotel, he was surprised to find Walt, Lily, and others all there on their way to Ireland for the premiere of Darby O'Gill. For weeks, people from Disney had tried to find Watkin in Denmark, but as they didn't have his itinerary, they weren't able to locate his hotel. Now, however, simply by chance, Watkin walked into the hotel where he and Walt used to stay, luggage in hand, to find Walt already there with new details about the Dublin premiere for Darby. The mood was one of quiet excitement, as most in the Disney party had high hopes for this film. The following day, the entire group, Walt, Lillian, Watkin, his wife, and others, flew to Dublin, where they were greeted by a crowd at the airport. At the edge of the tarmac was a line of bagpipe players. The 1953 Disney film Rob Roy, on which Watkin had worked, had featured bagpipe music, but that production had used Scottish pipes, which were smaller and had a more limited musical range compared to the Irish bagpipes. Now at the airport, Walt and Watkin were serenaded with the haunting music of Ireland, the mournful tunes coming from these instruments that were the distant relative of those once featured in a Disney film. As one onlooker recalled, Walt beamed his appreciation. He listened to a few traditional numbers, then indicated that his party needed to leave to stay on schedule. The same onlooker explained a hurried cup of coffee, and he was off to the Theatre Royal to fulfill the first of a big number of engagements. As he walked to a line of cars, Walt talked to reporters. He said that though not all Irish people still believed in leprechauns, he did. Then he and the rest of his party stepped into chauffeured cars. The lead car, in which Walt rode, held 2 green flags affixed to the hood, specifically created for this event. And the center of each green flag, as one person explained, was a miniature portrait of Mickey Mouse. As Watkin recalled, this caravan was led by a motorcycle escort with their police sirens blaring. The group was driven to the Theatre Royal, which was holding a children's matinee. Though the official premiere wouldn't happen until the evening, Disney had agreed to a midday screening for orphans and disabled children. They would be the first members of the public to see the film. As Walt, Watkin, and others were driven up to the theater, they could see that the street was dressed with pennants and banners. On the steps of the theater itself was another line of bagpipe players, again dressed in caps, kilts, and knee socks, ready to greet guests from Hollywood. The theater's marquee displayed the names of the featured actors, along with an image of Albert Sharp as Darby. Most of the listed actors were Irish, though there was one Englishwoman, Janet Munro, and one Scotsman, Sean Connery. Perhaps not coincidentally, on the premiere marquee, Connery was listed last, even though in the film he was listed third, in front of actor Jimmy O'Day. But here, for the premiere, O'Day's name had been moved up, perhaps because he was a local resident of Dublin. Once the driver parked, Walt stepped out of his car and walked into the theater, where children were arranged in their seats waiting for him to give a short talk. From the stage, he could see into the enormous auditorium. There were rows of kids, all in simple clothes. Dozens had crutches, still suffering effects of polio, as Ireland had endured some of the largest polio outbreaks in Europe. Their faces were tilted up to watch him. For them, Walt smiled. "Well, I suppose you would like if Mickey Mouse came out instead of me," Walt joked. "I had to leave him in Hollywood. He makes the money, so I can travel around." He talked a little about the film, then added, "Well, I love Ireland, and am happy that you could come and see Darby O'Gill." Again, he looked out at the children. Over 1,000 gathered into the front half of the theater, accompanied by nuns, most of them wearing white aprons and cloth veils covering their hair. He concluded his remarks by adding, "This film will bring your lovely country to millions of children all over the world." Once the presentation was over, Walt took photos with some attendees out in front of the theater. He met with the American ambassador, and then he and his party headed to his next appearance, which was with Ireland's president, Sean Thomas O'Kelly. By sheer coincidence, after 14 years of service, June 24th, the day of the premiere, was O'Kelly's final day as president. At midnight, he would hand over power and the president's residence to his successor, Amon de Valera. Because of this, O'Kelly, as president, wouldn't be able to attend that evening's premiere, as he would be moving out of the presidential mansion. Instead, he scheduled a meeting with Walt in the afternoon to express his interest and appreciation for the Disney project. The Disney Group, which almost surely included Larry Watkin and his wife, spent about an hour at the president's home before they headed to their hotels to prepare for the evening events. Walt and his group were the last official guests of state that O'Kelly received at the president's mansion. The official premiere was held in the evening with hundreds of onlookers gathered around the theater's entrance to see celebrities as they walked up the steps. The night was brisk, with temperatures dipping down into the low 60s and clouds gathering in the sky. All that was missing to make this a full Hollywood premiere were searchlights and TV cameras, though at least one radio station was there to record interviews that would air later that week. Repeatedly, the Irish press proclaimed that this was the first time that Walt Disney had premiered a film outside of the States. This was not true. Treasure Island had premiered in London, but the Disney team simply let this inaccuracy stand at least for the day. Albert Sharp was at the premiere, as was Barry Fitzgerald, the man to whom Walt had originally offered the lead role. Director Bob Stevenson was there, as was Jimmy O'Day, who in the film played the King of the Leprechauns. O'Day lived in Dublin, not far from the theater, and was adored by the crowd. Janet Munro was there, as was Sean Connery. Guests mingled for about an hour, then settled into their seats waiting for the festivities to begin. Before Walt presented his film to Dublin, Dublin presented a show for Walt. The show's organizers arranged for yet another group of bagpipe players to appear on stage, this time a massed band of over 100 musicians, creating a complex wall of music. Also performing was an orchestra, dancers, and a choir, with the event hosted by Irish radio and TV personality Pete Murray. Murray introduced each of the actors one by one to loud applause. Finally, he introduced Walt. Before leaving his seat, Walt turned to Watkin to ask, "What's the name of that guy who runs the Folklore Institute?" "Seamus DeLargy," Watkin said. Walt then walked to the stage, repeating DeLargy under his breath. Once at the podium, he talked about the actual origins of this picture, not that fanciful story that had been arranged into the TV episode. He explained that he had come to Ireland in 1946 to better understand Irish culture and folklore, a trip that had begun the 13-year journey that eventually produced the film everyone there was about to see. Research for the film began during a period when Walt saw his studio primarily as one focused on animation. The leprechauns initially were to be animated and placed beside actors, but the film went into production during a period when Walt understood how his studio could also work as a traditional live-action operation, with the leprechauns created through trick photography. He walked the audience through key moments of the film's development, but forgot to mention the name of that folklore scholar, which had seemed so important a few moments before. As he left the stage, music again swelled into the auditorium. Once it was over, the theater grew dark as the colors of a mock Ireland blossomed up on the screen. A lovely bit of Burbank, masquerading as the world that actually existed just outside the walls of this theater. The first shot was of the Irish village, built behind the animation building, beautifully framed in by a glass mat painted by Peter Ellenshaw. The film moved through the opening credits, which included multiple credits for Watkin. Watkin was credited for co-writing the film's 2 songs, along with composer Oliver Wallace. Then, in a far larger font, he was given full credit for writing the script. Typically, an author like Watkin, when using published fiction as a source, would be given credit for adapting the story for the screen. But here, as Watkin had invented so much of the script, including the problems faced by Darby and his daughter, he was listed as the actual writer, with additional material suggested by the book written by Kavanagh. As the film moved from credits to its opening scenes, A hush came down around the audience as the people of Ireland watched how Walt Disney presented the country where they lived. For the most part, they appeared deeply satisfied. The screening was followed by supper at the Mansion House, not far from the theater, which was the official residence of the Mayor of Dublin. According to Watkin, Walt had been drinking Scotch whiskey pretty freely, and though not obviously drunk, was right on the edge, which typically meant that he was in a good social mood. Guests gathered in the round room, which was the formal dining and event area capable of holding a few hundred guests. The space was decorated with hydrangeas and artificial pools stocked with rainbow trout. The floor was covered with rocks and turf so that the room appeared similar to the turn-of-the-century countryside featured in the film. Among various displays was a crock of pennies in which was hidden one small gold coin, nearly indistinguishable from the pennies around it. As each guest passed it, they were invited to reach in and take a single coin. The guest who drew the gold would be invited to a special state banquet later in the year. Walt understood that there had been risk for him as an American to present a film that explored the recent history and folk culture of Ireland, a country that he hadn't even visited before he became interested in this film. "Well, I'm very brave to come over here tonight," he admitted, "with this film I have done about Ireland and its peoples, legends, and suspicions." But he also sensed that the event was going well. Once cocktail hour was finished, supper was served by young girls dressed as leprechauns. After dinner, little packets of cigarettes were distributed to guests, with each cigarette only 1 inch long, the perfect size for the fairy folk. To commemorate the day, Walt Disney was given a 2-year-old silver and white Irish Connemara pony called Darby O'Gill, in a presentation where on-screen footage showed the animal's ability. Walt said that he would keep the pony on his property and perhaps even breed it. But it appears that by the following November, Darby O'Gill the horse was at Disneyland, where he was kept with other horses that appeared at the park. Though the President of Ireland wasn't at the supper, other high-level Irish officials were, including members of the cabinet and diplomatic corps, various ambassadors, as well as business and arts leaders. Most there felt the importance of this event, a feeling of deep satisfaction that luminaries from Hollywood were mixing with luminaries from Dublin. A Disney film on screens around the world and then later on TV would present Irish life and Irish folklore to tens of millions who likely had never visited Ireland. In this, the film would promote tourism to Ireland, advance the careers of Irish actors, and promote Irish products, including recorded music. But also, the film presented an extremely sympathetic and kind view of the Irish people. A film that subtly continued to rehabilitate Ireland's standing in the world after the war. Through this, the Disney film created not only a means to present Irish stories and folklore to millions of viewers outside the country, it also, in its own minor way, helped Ireland take another small step back into the larger Western world, a set of relationships that, at least from a political perspective, had been somewhat broken after the war. The Disney Group likely took away one more element from this premiere. Though Walt had created elaborate themed events for the premieres of animated features such as for Snow White, where his studio had built a replica of the dwarf's cottage for guests to enjoy, he had never done this for his live-action offerings. But here, at this Dublin premiere, the visual themes of the movie were carried over into the premiere, with leprechaun waiters, the Irish countryside recreated indoors, and the fabled crock of gold with one actual gold coin in it. Though Walt never mentioned how the Dublin event influenced later Disney premieres back home, Walt's experience here almost surely shaped how later large-budget live-action Disney films, such as Mary Poppins, were premiered in Hollywood, where the details of the movie spilled out of the theater into the event, allowing for the after-party to be an extension of the film. Darby O'Gill proved a crowning achievement for Watkin's career. The Los Angeles Times called it as physically perfect a job as can be had. The Technicolor, the camera work, the special effects, the Irish music and all are a rich feast for anyone's eye and ear. As for Watkin's contributions, the reviewer wrote, "There is a rather ingeniously arranged surprise ending, which we will not spoil for you." The New York Times praised it as an overwhelmingly charming concoction, in which Mr. Disney and Lawrence E. Watkin have given us more fairy folk legends and brogue than are heard on any soft summer's night at the Abbey Theater or a Third Avenue saloon. The film was a turning point for many involved in the production. Albert Sharp, who had largely been a character actor taking on secondary roles, now was a genuine star. The co-producer of a forthcoming James Bond film, Albert Macaulay, recognized something likable and firm in Sean Connery when he saw him on screen. "Oh, he saw me in Darby O'Gill and The Little People," Connery explained. "He thought I might qualify for the role and called his wife Dana. She told him, 'Why, that's James Bond.'" Months later, Connery was back in America, this time to shoot Dr. No, his first Bond film, setting him on the path to become an international star. Janet Monroe went directly from acting in Darby O'Gill to acting in The Third Man on the Mountain. A few months after Third Man wrapped, she started her third Disney picture, Swiss Family Robinson, which would be filmed largely on the island of Tobago and at Pinewood Studios in London. Both Third Man and Swiss Family were directed by Ken Anakin, the same director Walt had used for earlier UK films, Robin Hood and The Sword and the Rose. In this, with actors and directors, he allowed those around him to expand their abilities as the Disney studio worked toward more sophisticated and complex productions. But it wasn't just the actors whose lives were changed by this production. It also affected people such as Don DeGrady, an artist with a background in the production of animation. For Darby O'Gill, he had been asked to lay out the effects sequences moment by moment, focusing on how small story beats would be visually developed through each scene, and laying out a plan for each effect shot. Walt saw how valuable it was to include the animation staff on live action, not only for the sake of exact planning, but also so the live action features held some of the narrative wonder so deeply embedded into the animated features. Before Darby, DeGrady had worked on Peter Pan, Alice in Wonderland, Lady and the Tramp, among others. After Darby, he worked on Son of Flubber, Mary Poppins, Blackbeard's Ghost, The Love Bug, and Bedknobs and Broomsticks, all of which infused the whimsy and visual wonders of animation into live-action productions. As Peter Ellenshaw recalled after Darby, Walt wanted to have Don come over to the live-action unit. He did the storyboard better than anyone we'd ever seen. In this, the Disney studio now had a new live-action style. In addition to dramas and a coming wave of comedies, they now created live-action offerings that held the mythical spark often found in animation. Lastly, Darby O'Gill changed the physical footprint of the studio. After Darby wrapped, Walt and Roy understood that the studio needed its own movie ranch, specifically if they planned to release between 4 to 7 live-action features each year for the foreseeable future. In 1959, Disney bought the 315-acre Golden Oak Ranch, further cementing their transition into a major studio deeply focused on live action. At the time of its purchase, Disney planned to build a number of buildings, outdoor sets, and better arrange the grounds around the lake for movie production. The first production at Golden Oak under Disney ownership was The Swamp Fox, an 8-part adventure for the weekly Disney TV series about Francis Marion, a hero of the American Revolution. Initially, Disney had considered filming in the South, same as they had done for the Great Locomotive Chase, but concerns about snakes that lived in actual swamps led them to the convenience and relative safety of Golden Oak, a place that could be dressed and arranged to look like the South. In this, Disney, who had initially used far-off locales for most of its productions, such as Robin Hood and 20,000 Leagues, was acting far more like MGM or Warner Brothers now, shooting on a ranch where its scenes could be better controlled and arranged. After Walt, Watkin, and the others returned from the Dublin premiere of Darby O'Gill, they saw that trouble was building in Hollywood. Both the Writers and Actors Guilds were threatening to go on strike. At issue was residual compensation for older works as they appeared on TV, with millions of dollars at stake. In early September, the Writers Guild authorized a strike action against the studios. A week later, the Guild announced that they were making progress in their talks with the studios and delayed the start of a strike. But then, by the start of October, talks had again fallen apart, with the Guild voting to extend the authorization to strike, with the possibility of a strike beginning as soon as mid-November, though most expected that it wouldn't begin until after the holidays. Everyone in Hollywood understood that a writer's strike, if it happened, would largely shut down the industry for months. Television production would go down first, followed by theatrical production once studios finished filming completed scripts. The Actors Guild was also discussing a strike, one that might coincide with the one proposed by the writers, further crippling studios. As the situation continued to deteriorate, Walt made Watkin an offer, a proposal that would allow him to stay on at the studio even if production shut down. In one version of the story that Watkin later told, Walt asked Watkin if he would like to be a producer again. In a slightly different version, Walt asked if he'd like to be an assistant producer. Regardless, either role would have saved him from the coming labor troubles and also given him more authority as the studio looked to expand its production schedule. This offer almost surely was arrived at by Walt after considerable thought. 4 years earlier, as Watkin worked on The Great Locomotive Chase, Walt had needed live-action producers as the studio expanded production. But over the last 4 years, as Watkin hadn't been interested in taking on that role, Walt had promoted others into those positions, namely Bill Anderson and Bill Walsh, who were able to handle most of Disney's live-action output destined for theaters. Bill Anderson handled most of the dramas, while Bill Walsh handled the comedies. Occasionally, Walt would bring in an outside person as an associate producer, but also he was grooming his son-in-law, Ron Miller, to eventually take on this role. In this, Walt had no immediate need for another producer or assistant producer, meaning that this offer was, in all likelihood, designed to protect Watkin's employment with Disney. But when Walt made the offer, explaining that Watkin might work more on the business end of production, all Watkin could think about were those months in Georgia where he checked sets, supervised a director, and followed up with amateur part-time actors on The Great Locomotive Chase. "I knew that in offering me a producership," Watkin said, "he was paying me the greatest compliment he knew how to give. But I knew I'd be no good, for my heart wasn't in it." When Watkin turned him down, Walt looked at him a little confused. In Walt's mind, almost surely, he felt it was clear that he was creating a position, one that wasn't truly needed, so that Watkin would have continual employment with Disney even if writers went on strike for months. The rejection of this offer, likely from Walt's perspective, felt like a rejection of his kindness. "You mean," Walt said, "you just want to be a goddamn writer all your life?" "Yes," Watkin replied. "That's all I've ever wanted to be." Walt, who had started his career as an artist, then became an animator, then became a director before becoming a studio head and executive producer, found this difficult to understand. At the studio, artists who had started as animators were now working in theme park design and sculpting, set design, and in ride development. The nature of Hollywood as he saw it required individuals to grow and change. Beyond this, with the exception of a few key animators, Walt tended to value creative people who embraced the entire studio process, not just one element in it. And he had likely imagined that beneath Watkin's love of language, that he was like this as well. But Watkin was telling him that he wasn't. They both could feel it now that something had changed between them. Before this date, Watkin had, at least at times, done whatever was needed for a production, even acting as a type of unnamed producer for many films. But moving forward, Watkin had signaled that his role as a writer was more important to him than staying continuously with Disney. It was there now in the space between them, something that they each knew had the potential to change the road ahead, something that might change Watkin's role with Disney. I'll be back next week with a new episode, which will be the conclusion for our series about Walt Disney, Larry Watkin, and the early Disney live-action features. Also this week over on Bandcamp, I've arranged the story of the making of the Jungle Cruise into a Bandcamp album called The Ever-Changing Jungle Cruise. It runs about an hour and 40 minutes and tells the story of how the Jungle Cruise was created and how it changed up to the present day. Again, if you're looking for some of our longer series on Bandcamp, look for the word album in the title. If you click open an album, you'll find many episodes or chapters that tell the entire story. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.